Alright, hello ladies and gentlemen. Today I will be discussing the burden of proof in a religious debate. Essentially, usually religious debates go between an atheist, which is the non-believer, versus a theist, which is obviously the believer. And there has been an ongoing question in regards to who has to prove what. What is the burden of proof, and in what somebody has to prove something to the other position. And obviously, if you look at a religious debate and you approach it from the position an atheist versus a theist, one might regard the fact that the atheist has the burden of proof because obviously the God exists, so the atheists have to prove that God does not exist. And on the other hand, we have the other people that say that God does not exist, therefore theists have the burden of proof in order to prove us that God does exist. So in order to analyze this resolution and the debate in general, it's important to pay attention to the essential idea of the status quo. In debate, there's a status quo and there's somebody that is trying to change or disprove the status quo is actually true. Now, one might ask, how do we determine on which side is the status quo? And that is an excellent question, and this is why we have to pay attention to the resolution of the debate or the proposition. So in which way should we approach the proposition of the debate? Should we approach it from a positive perspective and say a creator exists? Or should we approach it from a negative perspective and say a creator does not exist? Obviously, the way in which you approach the proposition clearly shows who obtains the status quo and therefore who has to prove what. So when analyzing the proposition, we have two obvious answers. One is approaching from the positive and one approaching from the negative perspective. And then one might wonder, which proposition fits better the parameters of the debate? Which position is actually the way in which a debate should be interpreted, as in regards to a theist versus an atheist, or even a theist versus a theist? I will go on and talk about this later on. Now, when analyzing the proposition, it's really also important to highlight that you cannot prove a negative. It's essentially kind of the same thing as me saying, prove me that I'm not possessed by a demon, or prove me the sky is not red. So essentially, once this proposition fails, because you cannot prove a negative, the theists cannot have status quo, because essentially, in order for a theist to have status quo, that means the atheists have the burden of proof. And in order for an atheist to have the burden of proof, the atheist has to prove a negative. As for example, as I presented before, prove me that I'm not possessed by demons, or prove me that door can not open by itself, or something crazy like that. And this is why approaching the proposition or the resolution from the negative perspective completely fails. And ultimately, the burden of proof relies on the theist side. Because the only way in which you should approach a resolution or a debate proposition is from an affirmative perspective, because ultimately, again, you cannot disprove a negative. Now, theists might be mad right now and tell me that I'm nuts, and I cannot put entire burden of proof on a theist. Okay, well then let's have a religious debate between two theists. Obviously, one might wonder, then who has the status quo? A really generic example, I took an example in which the theists are really in contrast in regards to their beliefs. You have a monotheistic belief, Christianity, versus a polytheistic belief, which is Hinduism, because once you argue a theological debate and you have both people on the same side as, for example, different forms of Christianity, obviously the burden of proof and all of these things rely on a different parameter of debate, because you already agreed to the resolution that God exists. Therefore, the parameter of the debate changes and the status quo is obviously changed in different ways. But now, just for analyzing the burden of proof in regards to an atheist versus a theist, let's just pay attention to this specific instance when two theists of different religious beliefs argue. Which one has the status quo? Obviously, neither of them, and this is why. Let's say I'm a Christian and I debate a Hindu. Do I have status quo, and am I just supposed to go on a debate round and say, okay, well, Yahweh exists, so now it's your job throughout the entire debate round to prove me that Hindu gods, as for example Krishna and Ganesh and Vishnu and all of these gods exist, although the status quo is hypothetically on my side as the affirmative, as the Christian theist. Obviously, this seems unfair for the Hindu, because you cannot disprove status quo once it's on the parameters of believing in a god. As for example, the Hindu can go ahead and do the same thing. The Hindu can walk in the debate round and say, well, status quo is on my side, obviously Hindu gods exist, so therefore you as a Christian have the authority and the burden of proof in order to prove me the fact that my Hindu gods are wrong, and also on top of this, you have to prove me that the Christian god is obviously an accurate concept. And this is why ultimately, when two theists of different religions debate, status quo is still belonging to the atheists. Because, as for example, in the two theists, because here's why, essentially. The Hindu is atheistic towards Yahweh, and the Christian is obviously an atheist towards Krishna or Ganesh or any other Hindu god. So ultimately, he's an atheist when you're talking about his gods, and he's an atheist when you're talking about their gods. So ultimately, atheists still have status quo, even in a religious versus religious debate. And this is why, again, you cannot approach the proposition or the debate resolution from the negative perspective, and this is why ultimately the status quo belongs to atheists. So ultimately, reinforced, theists have to prove the atheists wrong. It's not the other way around. I'm not just saying this in order to bash. I already gave you not only an example and a situation in which the resolution cannot be approached from a negative perspective, as well as giving you a concrete example in which two religions debate, well, not the religions debate, but the religious people debate. So again, the burden of proof relies on theists. I'm open to rebuttals, obviously. I want to see how theists try to counter this. But comment below, I'm looking forward to this, so peace.